So today we have Dennis Ojima from Colorado State University and Jason Neff from the University of Colorado. And they are going to talk to us about Future Earth, which is a new research consortium or initiative that is bringing together a number of earlier initiatives that were going on. And I will turn it over to Dennis for. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And thank you all for this opportunity to share sort of where we're headed with this new program, this initiative, Future Earth. It really does build on a number of legacy programs. I'll describe some of these in a few minutes in my presentation, but it really, the various global environmental change programs have been sort of collapsed together under this one umbrella with the understanding that as we looked at sort of global climate, looking at the changes in biogeochemistry, changes in the biodiversity, looking at the massive changes that are taking place in the social economic realm, that having these programs kind of isolated in sort of these sub-disciplinary sort of pods, this wasn't really helping us to solve problems. That we really need to look across these type of issues and sort of bring our knowledge together in order to really start looking at solutions. And so in this too, one of the things that we've been talking to John and others at USAID and other development agencies across the world is how do we actually bridge and share the knowledge that we have and bridge this with the knowledge that you have as practitioners or those working in development activities so that we can actually then align and share this information so that, again, solutions are more readily available, or at least how we can use that information and work with various partner organizations and groups to really start looking at how do we reduce the risk associated with that. So what I'll do is, this is mostly a lot of it's a programmatic talk. I'll give a brief example from work that I've been doing recently in Mongolia, just finishing up on some adaptation work as an example of what we see as something in way of working from the science and theory aspects to actual practice and working with local communities as an example of some of the work that we hope to do through Future Earth. These type of complex challenges across the world is, looking at, sort of food security, 9 billion people, looking at ocean acidification, looking at ocean coastal issues related to the changing environment, looking at adaptation, heat islands in various urban settings across the world, disaster reduction, especially with coastal systems and sea level rise and storm surge, ecosystem services and protecting biodiversity, looking at accessibility and the equity issues related to how do communities move toward global sustainability, looking at sort of gender diversity, other issues of equity and access. All these things are very familiar to you. And these are things that, in the way that we've been applying our research from the research community, have been really poor in providing, actionable science findings to sort of work in this arena. So the combination of core projects and science bodies that came together to define this mission is really trying to meet some of those challenges that we see across the world. So provide knowledge required for societies that we have to face these risks posed by these changes and look for opportunities so that we can transition toward global sustainability. So the Future Earth Initiative is sort of geared for an initial 10-year phase. We'll see how successful we are and what the next phase will be. So we're sort of in the early phases of that of this 10-year initiative. The type of groups that we've traditionally have worked with, the research community, the science community has put together, are described in sort of these entities: the World Climate Research Program, the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, the Versitas International Human Dimensions Program, have been sort of these sectoral type academic enterprises to understand the type of changes that are taking place across the globe. And how has the Earth system been changing? And we've done a pretty good job of understanding various facets of this. But in an attempt to look at a more integrated view, the partnership of these programs formulated an Earth System Science Partnership to look at things like food, water, health. Which one am I missing? Carbon, of course. Looking at the Global Carbon Project, really more integrative studies. But again, we really weren't getting the type of integration that we needed to address these problems. And so through a visioning process over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been working toward sort of a common pathway forward that emerged under the joint auspices of this funding body, a group of funders in the Belmont Forum, and the science community through the International Council of Science, the International Social Science Council, working together. And when they looked at their visioning documents, they saw there's a lot of overlap, and that they decided, since they're both working toward the same goals, to merge them. And that emerged in 2012 at the Planet Under Pressure conference to be inaugurated as the Future Earth Initiative. So it's really bringing all those different moving parts, all those programs under one roof to move forward. So we have now what they have formed, this alliance, the Science Technology Alliance for Global Sustainability. This is an older slide. WMO is now a full partner in this enterprise. But you see that the two science organizations, ICSU and the ISSC, you have a number of UN bodies, UNEP and UNESCO, United Nations University, WMO, and then the funding bodies, IGFA and the Belmont Forum. So they're all working together in this confederation or this alliance to govern and to fund the Future Earth agenda. Our platform is really one that is built around international collaboration, looking at sort of these transdisciplinary ways of looking at various problems, and really trying to come up or informing solutions through the research that we do. And through this process of looking at how, with various partners from the user community or from areas of the private and public sectors, looking at how we co-design, co-develop, and produce research outcomes that are useful and beneficial to the user communities. So this is where, especially in this latter part, where initiating dialogues with practitioners who are working in the field to look at development activities, looking at what are useful, sustainable pathways that the private and public sector are looking at or are contemplating, and how do we actually align some of the research to move forward in these arenas. So in this sort of design process, we're looking at greater stakeholder involvement early on in the process, and as we are defining the research, looking at ways of implementing and looking at monitoring of various activities. And then as we implement some of this, then we'll do the research that's relevant and then go into co-production where the information is exchanged, products are evaluated, new projects or a new research agenda emerges in that sort of more user-defined stakeholder involvement. So we see this as an iterative process, and one that sort of is dynamic in a way of interacting more closely with various stakeholder communities or user communities and practitioners. Within the initiative, we have 3 major themes identified. We have one called Dynamic Planet, Global Development, and another Transformation to Sustainability. And within this, we have sort of are able to place some of these activities that call for, sort of system-oriented looking at, development of models, data management, research infrastructure, which will enable these activities across these three themes. And then as we sort of look more in depth at these different aspects of these thematic areas, many of the existing research activities kind of fall into this dynamic planet in sort of our basis of our understanding of what's changing around the world. But what's exciting to a number of us is this sort of area in the global development and transformation and sustainability. And so the Future Earth community is already working and helping look at the research needs as we look at the new Sustainable Development Goals, and working closely with the Commission on Sustainable Development to align some of the research that we do in Future Earth to better understanding and defining processes of reducing poverty, reducing risk, looking at food security issues, looking at the social dimensions of gender equity, and looking at empowerment, access to a variety of social goods. So there's a stronger alignment now between some of the Earth system science that we've done traditionally, but looking at through the lens of global development. And that leads then to sort of looking at transformations to sustainability, where a number of societies and communities are looking at green development, low carbon economy pathways as a pathway strategy toward a more sustainable utilization of our natural resources and ecosystem services. And so through these various activities and related to renewable energies, improving risk, reducing hazards, looking at more integrative systems, decision making, we see that the research community can help, or at least contribute to defining some of these pathways, again in sort of this co-production or co-design, co-development structure. So this is the new sort of paradigm shift in the traditional way of we're doing research, is that we really want to also inform decision making and practitioners in a co-design, co-development, and co-production way, production of new knowledge and looking at actionable research. Well, and doing this while we're maintaining our strong fundamental research activities as well. So our principles is really try to develop a platform where transdisciplinary science and knowledge sharing can be brought together, looking at multiple scales of socio-geographical approaches, really understanding more the context of which these changes are taking place, as well as the opportunities related to solutions. Really looking at this linkage between understanding the dynamics of global environmental change and looking at the trajectory of various development activities. We want to then use this platform of Future Earth and to build these partnerships across a number of stakeholders, including researchers and practitioners, and then bring on board sort of a new generation. And I think that new generation is really eager to look at this solution space. The students that we train at the universities are already interested in seeing how we actually look at these, unpack this complexity and actually find solutions. Some of the activities that the Belmont funders have been doing is really looking at some initial infrastructure development in the way of looking at observing systems and how do we align the various national efforts into a global effort, looking at reduction of risk and understanding these sort of extreme events and how they play out across the globe. Look at the provisioning of environmental information to a broad set of users, looking at ways of developing these transdisciplinary research activities that really build upon, sort of the knowledge embedded in these different disciplines that cut across these social ecological systems. And then really try to develop a much better integration, coordination mechanism to really look at this as the world in particular places as a system, so that unintended consequences could be reduced. We've seen several phases of the first sort of funding opportunities through the Belmont process, which will evolve into more, I guess, alignment to the science agenda of Future Earth. But some of the initial funding activities were looking at coastal vulnerability, freshwater security. Just last year, we had calls on food security, this data fusion, looking at the development and support for the interim secretariat was now transitioning to the permanent secretariat, and then looking at development of the alliance governance for this whole process. A lot of this was described at the 2012 meeting, Planet Under Pressure, and so the initial sort of roadmap for Future Earth was given out at that time. This is the initial design that came out in 2013, based on discussions and what was inaugurated in 2012 at Planet Under Pressure. Some of the short-term and sort of the documents that they're producing is a 2025 vision, sort of setting up some of the milestones that we're aiming for, looking at the some of the strategic research areas in the medium-term research priorities, and then developing and funding some cross-disciplinary activities in these fast-track initiatives that were funded this past year. So as the Secretariat and things that we're trying to do within Future Earth, we're really trying to maintain this interdisciplinary research to understand the changes in your system, provide this knowledge sharing, and translate these to the research communities and other stakeholders. And also, sort of really being that platform where co-development across these various, misspelled research, that we provide that platform across a variety of communities. So, so we're trying to evolve and maintain science policy connections, especially with IPCC and IPBES, but there are other conventions that we'll be working with, in addition, looking at contributions and defining how we evaluate sustainable development goals. In the development realm, again, we are contributing to look at what are some of the research gaps within understanding or developing these sustainable development goals. So we have input into that. We're also seeing a need in discussions with various folks in the development activities that how do we actually incorporate more directly some of the research information into development of these pathways, and then looking at partnerships that we can build between our communities and make it more seamless in the way that having two-way type of activities funded and sponsored. We're also working with the private sector. There are a variety of things that we could provide in way of knowledge sharing between the various communities, research communities, and the private sector, looking at a platform where information is exchanged and between these communities in both directions, and then co-developing research activities in sort of this neutral space that isn't proprietary, but has more of a public openness to it. So these are some of the current challenges that, and we have seen how the Earth system is behaving in a non-stationary way, looking at sort of a system-oriented approach that has a socio-ecological framing to it, looking at the sort of understanding and incorporating multi-scaled, multi-criteria processes into looking at various projects and their outcomes, and that understanding that complexity is real, and that's, many people just live with it and deal with it, but that complexity is part of the solution as well. An example of that then is sort of the situation in Mongolia. And then I just finished this project this past summer, where we've been looking at development pathways, especially as we see various rangeland systems being impacted by expanded mining interests throughout Mongolia. But also recognize that the people there were highly reliant on these, and self-sufficient in many ways, on these ecosystem services. In the past, they've had social systems to deal with droughts, winter extremes, but with changes in the market structure, actually enhanced their vulnerability to these type of climate-related stresses in a way that wasn't anticipated. That in fact, through privatization of the market, especially with the expansion of goat production for cashmere, that made the system more vulnerable in the past 15 years. And then also we saw this, we're exploring the disconnect between how the central government of Mongolia was utilizing its development resources and not supporting the pastoral livelihoods. This misalignment then was part of our study to see how we could expand the dialogue between members of the ministry and local pastoral communities across different parts of Mongolia. And the sort of issue that many developing countries face, the laws are there, just the enforcement was really poor. And how do you actually get resources out to the communities so that they could enforce them and become more self-regulating? So we put together used this sort of livelihood framework and looking at different aspects of the system. So describe sort of what were some of the benefits and weaknesses in the system. And so we're able to characterize that. I've been working there for over 20 years. So with my colleagues from Mongolia, we were able to collect this information pretty rapidly. We found that, sort of response strategies, this is sort of generic sort of guidelines that we were using, that response strategies are local, that these climate change impacts, because if you didn't realize that one of the fastest warming regions of the world is in that area of sort of high latitude Asia. So from Mongolia into Siberia, this area is one of the warmest places in the world. And so it's impacting their water resources, the phenology of the grasslands, rangelands, those sorts of things. So you're seeing multiple sets of changes that are affecting their water and land use. They're being impacted also by different economic and sectoral changes because of the market fluctuations related to cashmere. And so, part of the approach that we used was sort of manage for resilience and seeing through the system lens how we can better manage the ecosystem services for these pastoralists. We had sort of this aim of looking at meeting multiple goals between production and development, looking at sort of how do we do that in the face of these extreme events, and especially when particular systems, the social cultural systems were deteriorated because of changes in rural to urban migration in the age structure, education structure. Although one of the things that was really remarkable about Mongolia, when I first started working there, the education level was, they're 99.5% literate. Right now, I think it's down to about 95%, but it's phenomenal how well educated the Mongolian population is. You're seeing issues that, how do we restore various system components, looking at how do we move, how they're able to move their herds, reestablish sort of rights to move across political boundaries, reducing sort of the limitations that have occurred over the last decades of constraining movements of animals during these climate and weather events in their system. So we also were interested in looking at how do we take some of the ecological theory that we have and social ecological theory and apply it and understand it in practice. So we did this in a sort of adaptive management mode. We did some characterizations. You know, we see some changes, quite a dramatic change between what happened right at the time of the Soviet collapse. Mongolia, as you may know, was a sort of a satellite country. A lot of subsidies were brought in by the Soviet Union. That then was cut off, and then new sort of social economic networks were developed after that. And so you saw a privatization of herds. You saw a change toward a market-driven herd structure. So in the past, prior to 1990, it was a meat production system that was farmed out or shipped out to the Soviet Union. And so a lot of the practices were governed by that sort of meat production, and shifted over to more of a market-driven cashmere system. And you're seeing the changes in goat numbers and other things that affected their ability to withstand both economic and climate changes. So in summary, we see that, you know, of course, these dryland systems are sensitive, but the social economic changes, especially look at privatization of the herd structure and the market-driven aspects, have really changed the productivity of the lands, even having a bigger effect on their vulnerability and their resilience to these environmental changes. We're looking at mechanisms for recovering these ecosystem services that are reinstating some of the social and cultural practices that allowed for more long distance movements of animals, especially during droughts, and looking at the ability from the central government to enhance their environmental monitoring and forecasting so that information exchange can take place. So some of the suggestions from the Mongolian herders and some of the NGOs that work there, working with the Swiss development agency, was, you know, they had been practicing or working on developing mobile phone apps to actually do the early warning systems. And I think, you know, those are technologies that we can use in other places in the world as well. So it was really quite rewarding to work in this community with seeing these type of practices. We're moving, you know, sort of based on these studies, we're working in other places in Africa and other parts of Asia to look at, you know, sort of how do we understand these changes in goods and services in relationship to human systems, looking at how we can develop these in sustainable ways. Oops. And then looking at sort of the relative role of demographic changes and land use practices on the Earth system, and then looking at these different management schemes to provide sustainable options. So this is sort of some of the things that we're doing still with the Mongolian Ministry of Environment and Green Development. It's interesting that with the new government that came in 3 years ago, they had a large-scale change of how the ministries were oriented. So the Ministry of Nature and Environment became this new Ministry of Environment and Green Development. So they're really looking at their ecosystem service legacy and how to actually maintain it to build their economy. And it's one of the 4 key ministries that sort of guide the national strategy. So it's really an enlightening way of looking at their natural resources. So we're looking at, you know, sort of Future Earth with a strong legacy of Earth system science, looking at this really broader team approach and how we do research and the way it's co-developed. It's really looking at this open science development, you know, really having a number of partners bringing their knowledge together to help solve problems. Want to foster this sort of Earth system development interaction and knowledge sharing, looking at mechanisms for this co-design of this integrated research and development, and then lastly, sort of how do we do this in a way that fosters resilience and preparedness in these different systems that we work. So with that, I think, thank you, and questions. Oh, either way, you know them, so you.
Yes, I forgot to do introductions, and I apologize. So if you have a question, why don't you introduce yourself and say who you work with? And I have a question. We've talked about this a little bit in the past. I'm John with USAID. I'm curious, if you go back to the previous slide, the last point I think is about the concluding remarks. There. So the better bridging and the co-design of research and the development agenda. Could you talk a little bit about how either a donor agency like AID or some of our contractor and private and NGO implementing partners might engage with Future Earth? I know that one way for AID or NSF is to fund, but in a more substantive way, how might we engage?
I think in ways of looking at how different development activities are designed, and if it's on food security issues, sort of bringing in early on in that design phase some of the pertinent research communities in way of looking at the sort of the physical environmental changes that might be taking place, looking at some of the social structures that social scientists that might be involved in looking at food systems, and sort of just kind of work toward that co-development, co-design of that research, of that development activity. And conversely, I think from the research community side, as we do research on food systems or looking at areas of public health, bringing in sort of different members of the development community. You say, we're going to be doing this study in East Africa. What is it? What sort of activities are you doing? What sort of knowledge, or community, cultural dimensions should we be aware of as we do this research? And so I think there's a two-way street of how we could better do our research, as well as then the partnering with development in way of looking at their strategies and providing sort of information on what we might know about the water cycle, what we know about climate extremes, what we know about biodiversity that might be novel or emerging from the research community. So I think that co-planning of research and development activities and finding a platform where we could do that more seamlessly, I think would be a useful approach.
Yeah, John, the other thing I would add here is I think, what we would like this to be, what we would like Future Earth to be, is really a bridging organization, that it is a place where communities that are very separate, more separate than they really should be, can actually find common ground and explore common questions. And so I would say to everyone in the room, if we're successful, then you will view us as one mechanism by which, you can bring these two different, very unique and important spheres of knowledge together to actually create solutions. So I hope that's where we'll be in a year or two.
Hi, John Hansen, Paradigm Project. And sort of in alignment with this as well, to better understand the scale of the projects that you work on. How micro do you go? Is it very macro? What are the various applications of it on the different scales? And do you also get into the sort of trying to think of the right words, but like the sort of the local economic scale, the local economic resiliencies, and issues of that in terms of in relation to the different resiliency adaptations? I guess I'll leave it at that. See what comes up.
In some ways, we're going to be limited to looking at more general aspects at a higher scale, but we're trying to develop, sort of principles and best practices that could be applied. But as we develop those type of best practices or principles, to be able to test them and use them at a scale that's much more local, almost village level type efforts. And for me, I think we're going to have to work at these multiple scales to be effective. What we'll be doing at the Secretariat level will really be 30,000 feet sort of scale, but hopefully learning from research activities and development activities that are done from on the ground.
Maybe, Dennis, the other thing to mention here is that the actual global secretariat is 5 nodes or hubs: the U.S., Sweden, Canada, France, and Japan. But there will be regional hubs underneath that. So those will include Africa, different parts of Latin America, different parts of Africa, India. There's another one in Japan. So those may be entry points actually for a much more focused and detailed discussion of what's happening in specific conditions in specific places.
I'm Jano Menzer Suarez, and I work in the humanitarian sector with Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, but I'm also with the Boston University Party Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. And I'm here with John, but something John may not know about me is about 20 years ago, I was actually a goat farmer. So give my regards to Dr. Zogsoren. And I was part of a USDA SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research grant project. And our research question was whether or not cashmere could be a viable source of supplemental income for small farmers. And I was specifically interested because around 1990, time of Namibian independence, as well as Mongolia, I was looking at the goat as this ubiquitous kind of cash in the bank animal that can survive. I was trying to elevate it as drought resistant agriculture at that time. But the idea was that actually cashmere is putting a cash crop on a subsistence animal. And it's putting a cash crop on an animal that can produce a much higher quality fiber if it is managed. And to manage it, you need to do essentially, land use management. So I got off the cashmere production cycle because I was aware that trying to sell this idea to African farmers in the mid-90s was not a good idea because cashmere was going into this roller coaster as China transitioned from being the largest exporter to the largest importer and producer. But that brings me back to where we're going, in terms of adaptation, in terms of adaptive or restorative development in a changing climate. And I think the Mongolia example, the combination of my background and what you've shared, is really illustrative of how, in many ways, forgive me for saying, we may be missing the point. And the need for this integrative research has never been greater. We come at things from so many different silos. So I would ask, what are the reasons why cashmere failed in Mongolia? I would propose that potentially one of the solutions for the future is that they were not focusing on breeding stock, and they weren't focusing on building relationships between Mongolia as a potentially leading producer of genetic material in producing high quality cashmere and other developing countries that would have an interest if they knew. The Speaker of the Namibian Parliament actually went to Mongolia in the 90s, spoke with the Parliament about potential trade ties based on goat production, but not just for cashmere, to look at it as something that, depending on the vagaries of the climate, you could go more into meat, more into milk, more into, you vary the balance. You're not going for optimization of one product. So this is this idea that now in my new hat work, working with World Bank Economists for Sustainable Development and Rand Corporation, we're talking about robust decision-making, which means how do we do pressure testing for multiple different futures so that we have a more resilient economic base.
Right.
And coming back again to the Mongolia example, so if the Mongolians have discovered that actually restoring or correcting some of the barriers for pastoralism is leading to more prosperous lives for more of the population, how can that translate into learning that can inform policy and practice in other countries where they have similar kinds of populations? So if we look at, African pastoralists, next hat, I was with GEF for 11 years in water resources, talking about the silos, thinking in terms of arid environments. Why aren't we working with biodiversity to combine biodiversity corridors with pastoralist corridors or protection of pastoralist lands as a hedge in a more volatile climate future? So all of these things are just, to celebrate what you're doing, but also to ask about the larger sort of framework vision. We never seem to get to what is the bigger transformation that we want to be working towards. And I'd be interested to know if you're looking at that meta level of what would a global economy with internalized externalities actually look like. Sorry for being so long.
From the Mongolian situation, there's a lot of hidden stories in there that I wasn't able to capture. One is that if you look at the crash in livestock numbers and prior extreme events, heavy winter storms, prior to 1990, the loss of animals were actually quite less. Like they're maybe 10, 20%. We're seeing catastrophic losses now because of the type of land management, the type of herd management that they're doing with a higher dependence on goats. And there's a number of different subsidy type infrastructure that also changed. The ability to have land protected for hay production and have that delivered where it was needed under the Soviet Union versus now where everyone was sort of Wild West, you live on your own. And so the infrastructure and economy is recovered enough where there's now looking back, as a country, can they do that? And actually look at a broader land use set of practices that would reestablish the ability to have reserves of hay under these climate conditions so that you don't lose that many animals. But the market system too then has really then thrown a different dynamic of how that cash crop has really then dominated the whole livestock industry, where it was pretty much probably 70% meat production, under the Soviet system, a lot more cattle, and the cattle and sheep were pretty stable. Goats were much lower. Now goats are probably 60% of the sort of sheep equivalents of the livestock numbers. And so that's unweighted sort of the balance of what they would call the 5 major livestock. They had camel, horses, cattle, sheep, and goats. So it's unbalanced that, and so they're trying to look at what is it that they need to do in that broader socio-economic and socio-ecological framing. So, and the other aspect that we're looking at is reconnecting the method of dialogue, information exchange from the local to the national level. And actually, so we had a workshop last October where the minister, Oyun, who's really an enlightened woman, the Minister of Environment and Green Development, sat with this diverse group of herders and county leaders, state leaders, and just sort of exchanged views. And I think that was a lot of the herders says, well, we never sat down with the minister before. This is great, and this established a better trust. And so we're trying to actually working with Minister Oyun and with some of the ministry lead scientists and lead managers, trying to foster that. So I think, so we're making small baby steps in that direction.
I'm Andrew Tabor. I'm from the Mountain Institute. I had a couple of comments and I guess sort of a question. One, I see this as being a tremendous and exciting opportunity to generate knowledge. And I can see the sort of pathways to impact in terms of larger national level policy issues. I think taking it down to the more at the grassroots, more at the community level is where I'm scratching my head a little bit. How can you get the science to sort of partner, as it were, with local communities? Stakeholders, stakeholders, when you mention stakeholders, I'm not sure whether you mean development practitioners, whether you mean local communities, which sort of sets of users of the work. What we know at the smaller development level, at the more micro level, the more integrated the science development is, or generation is with local communities, the more apt it is to be picked up. Otherwise, you're going to get great science journal articles, but you're not necessarily get change on the ground. And so that whole sort of process, how can this be better integrated? We're really a practitioner on the ground sort of organization, although we do science. I'm excited about figuring out how we can interact with this to get at some of the larger science questions, but at the same time, we would want to figure out how to better integrate this into the work we're doing at the community level. And I wondered what your thoughts has been. It's easy to think about at the national policy level. How can we take this down to the level and generate real results on the ground, almost at the village level, and then upscale the other way?
That's where I think this partnership is needed,
Right.
Because we don't know. I don't know. I don't have a good plan. And it's really, having sort of, a continuous dialogue of how do we scale the knowledge to a useful level, and how do we actually engage, across these various political boundaries and sectoral boundaries that are there. And it's, I don't know how. And so I think we need to figure this out.
Yeah, I think you articulated one of the key challenges, and I think the answer to that is that we're not going to figure it out on our own.
Really exciting.
This is why a partnership and an exchange of ideas and a real dedication to doing exactly what you're describing is, what will make this actually work and will make it different from what's going on today. I mean, that's where we need to go. So collectively, we have to figure out how to get there.
We're trying sort of, I don't know quite what to call it, barefoot science or just some approaches coupled with more active.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like, so there's.
So exchanging those ideas in some sort of formal, venue with other scientists that are committed to or interested in that kind of approach might be one way of actually expanding out some of those as a case studies into something that's more real and sustainable.
So like looking at adaptation demonstration projects, right? Or resilient management, but demonstration projects in different situations so that we can actually learn from those.
I mean, that's my head over what are the enabling about that and mind-boggling. One of the things related to that is education. I actually think education is first in terms of health integration in the rural areas. That's not research. Education levels, what? I think maybe that's not a topic of your research objectives, but I think it just raises another question related to resilience.
Hi, I'm Ian Fitzsimmons with Still Point Solutions, and many of us here are observers of international organizations working in environmental fields, and getting a feel for what will distinguish Future Earth from many of these other organizations. I don't really understand. I understand that there's an emphasis on engagement, and in fact, you have, in addition to the Secretariat, an engagement and a science committee, you have an engagement committee.
That's right.
I don't understand what are the mechanisms of engagement. Will you be doing grant proposal cycles? Are you going to have a kind of a stone soup approach where you put in a little and you invite others to bring in then their funding and ideas to the table? On the Future Earth website, there's good list of very interesting, really interesting looking projects, but I don't understand, are any of these projects already now U.S. projects? What is the distinctive function of the U.S. hub? Is it to bring U.S. research together? Is it to advocate for U.S. policy making fora? Can you bring it down to earth a little bit more, the vision here?
So you've asked a lot of different facets and dimensions. On the engagement side, it's going to be a combination of approaches to where they're really looking at ways of getting both into the policy decision-making area more information and information exchange so that those decision makers can actually also define what what is needed so that the research can be better oriented to their needs. In that same sort of vein, that's what in the private sector looking at, how, come back to the food system example where various corporations are looking at, sustainable sourcing of materials, but then it's really the food system that they really need to be looking at, all the way from, the waste that's, produced when they're processing it, the waste that happens at the table when we consume it. There's a whole series of places where efficiencies and we just need to be better at it. How do we research that with the private sector? You could think of water, you could think of energy, you could think of all those sort of sectors. So we're trying to find a platform of engagement with those communities or sectors who can define sort of what they need and work with them and work at sort of better understanding that connection. That'll be done through a series of funded grants, probably with different organizations, bringing in like you said, Stone Soup, we're bringing in their resources, but put in a public space so that the proprietary or sort of the information that's nationally or culturally sensitive, is protected. But there's a common platform where it's much more open and we can work together. So multiple ways of doing that. The role of the U.S. hub. So we're a partner, as Jason mentioned, of a distributed secretariat, all serving a common role. That we're not just a reincarnation of one program over another, but we all have a common vision, working in a single secretariat. And so the idea is to have the secretariat reside in the cloud. That's a virtual secretariat. We have 5 countries that are working together, but all serving. So if you want to see us in the secretariat, you go into the cloud portal, and you'll see all our doors open. And you could interact with someone from Japan or someone from Sweden. It doesn't really matter. We'll be all there. And so it's more of that international, global, collaborative nature that would be functioning. With that said, we've been having discussions with agencies this past week as well here in town, and over the last six or past year, 6 months or 12 months, really trying to foster a better idea of how some of the U.S. research and U.S. policy issues can fit into a broad agenda like Future Earth. And not that, we have to be somewhat careful because no one country should dominate the agenda. But yet there's so much richness and set of activities going on within the U.S. context, abroad and domestically. It's difficult to ignore that, and we really want to try to find a way of aligning some of that energy, some of those resources, some of the human resources, to really facilitate some of the things that we're trying to accomplish in Future Earth. So we have this sort of delicate balancing act of recognizing the role and importance of U.S. engagement without it dominating any of the agenda, but being, working in conjunction. I think having this distributed secretariat where we have members and partners in Japan and Europe and regional partners, throughout the world, that they can check on, say, no, that's not really going to be useful to us. How can we, tweak that so that's more broadly useful? It's not just a North American or a Northern viewpoint. That's actually a global perspective. So that type, sort of, we're very sensitive to that, and so we're just going to have to, make sure that we have people watching us, metrics that we put in place that make sure that we don't, fall too far one way or another.
But I think the one thing I would add here too is that, so we're a global secretariat, so we have to serve that role. However, it doesn't mean everything has to be global, and there's lots and lots of interest and opportunity in trying to serve local needs, and that includes the United States, right? So we've been today to DOE, to NASA, to U.S. Global Change Research Program, and now here, and everybody says the same thing. We're too siloed. These problems are too big. We're working in these individual little pieces, and we've got to find a way to bring things together. That's exactly what Future Earth is intended to do. So, having the Global Secretariat hub in the United States is great because it will provide support for all the things that Future Earth embodies that many of the agencies in the United States government would like to see happen as well. And so I would view the Secretariat as a mechanism for accomplishing what are common goals across a lot of agencies, even if those goals are United States based, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I'm kind of a workshopper also, so these are like working groups to me. These sort of things as well, trying to figure out how we can solve the different engagement issues. So I work on very micro, local community projects as well as on very macro things as well. And I love being able to go between those. Mm-hmm. And you may already be doing this or trying to address it, and maybe capacity issues as well. But the identification of some slightly larger than local village type projects where you can then bring in all the different currently siloed agencies or research and science sectors to come together and start developing up from that scale in participation with engagement, empowerment, and education with the local community, not coming in as an imposer of, we've got all the great science, but as a humble learner about what is your ecosystem, your watershed, what are your resources, all that kind of stuff, and then trying to find ways to engage and build out from that could help to be pilots essentially to scale up from, like you were talking about scaling up issues as well, because we have to work both macro and micro, macro to micro, micro to macro, because it is all integrated systems. But it's also about local context. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. Maybe you're already working on some of that stuff, that is larger than the village, but smaller than the region kind of stuff. Yeah.
Now, one way to maybe think about this is a lot of the legacy of the programs that are embedded in Future, they're big scale sort of science programs. And that's kind of we got to translate the science into the development on the ground. And that's been sort of this, unidirectional model for a long time. But the goal of Future Earth is really to have a bidirectional flow of information. And there is the intent to grow up new types of programs underneath Future Earth. So as a constituency, as a stakeholder, as a participant in this process, if folks in this room wanted to see something evolve that, say, moved from the local up to tried to understand that translation of knowledge or the bidirectional flow, that would be a wonderful example of a new sort of project that could emerge under Future Earth and then, sort of sit on par with all these kind of like large-scale or system science programs. So, I would throw out that in fact, it's this community and similar communities that can come together if you buy into the Future Earth idea and say, look, no, that's not enough to go this way. We want to see you go this other way, and here's how you might do it. Open to that dialogue.
Hi, my name is Michael Cody. I'm with IRG Agility, and I have a sort of a more basic question about the structure of Future Earth. Can you talk a little bit about your organizational chart, like how many people are you as an institution, and then
you're looking
also,
at it.
Okay, so into that, and then you're with University of Colorado. So what is your engagement with students? Are you bringing in bachelor students or masters or PhD postdocs? Like, what is your interface with students, and what is it there that you're asking them to do?
He's at CU Boulder.
Yeah.
I'm Colorado State University, so he'll answer the question.
Right. All right. So international structure. So 5 hubs around the world, somewhere between 30 and 40 permanent staff. But what those permanent staff are doing are facilitating a lot of activity. So the estimates of the number of sort of scientists involved in this process are in the tens of thousands because of the sort of reach of all these different projects. So that's kind of the big scale. The local scale, I think we're thinking a lot about this. I think, you know, at CU Boulder, for example, we're trying to figure out, you know, whether we actually have an opportunity with Future Earth on the campus, it's probably the same thing at CSU, to create a new type of training program, you know, that where we could actually talk about training people who are thinking about development and environment and global change simultaneously. In fact, we just started a certificate program on global environmental affairs, and that's a science and what we call an international affairs major joint certificate. So now we need to figure out how to get those students actually doing stuff that's really interesting. You could imagine the same thing in professional masters. We've actually had a dialogue about whether we could do professional master's training in something related to these areas, creating a different type of professional, actually probably similar to what you guys do. So yeah, I mean, we're working on it.
But as a secretariat, you know, what we're seeing our role is really, you know, being the implementer of various activities and being the enabler of these communities to get together and things. So our primary mission will be, you know, sort of being that service organization, and we're kind of viewing this as a business enterprise. Of we have services to provide, we have this huge community and a growing community, you know, that are the researchers, and then bringing in these new stakeholders, and there's capacity building and training just to get those stakeholders, including the research community, you know, to actually work together. And so this sort of educational part from the university side is sort of an add-on that will, you know, sort of being done because they're seeing sort of the need being in the global community, in society, for these type of skill sets. And we're hoping to influence the educational system. We ourselves won't be specifically developing curricula on this, with the one caveat that in capacity building we'll be doing some work and doing like summer institutes and training workshops, you know, sort of those sorts of things. But that won't be, I think that won't be the major activity that we do. That would be like maybe 10% of our investment.
As a secretariat, we won't. As faculty, well, you know.
Yeah, that's different.
We
Yeah.
might still.
Will you be networking with other universities with environmental sciences and earth systems science departments? Or, I mean, is that a part of your vision?
Yeah, we hope to. But we don't know what exactly that mechanism will be. You know, our initial plan was so part of the history of the Secretariat bid was that through colleagues at CU Boulder and at Colorado State University, we had put in a pre-bid to where we would sort of be the Secretariat. You know, but then with university partners around the world to share the load. So we had a number of universities in mind to partner with. When we met last November as a group in France at ICSU, brought us all the bidders who submitted a pre-proposal into a workshop. At that time, the 5 countries that now are the Secretariat actually formed then. And so sort of some of the initial ideas of working with these other universities were put aside because we had enough to deal with the French, the Swedes, the Canadians, and the Japanese in this new consortium that we formed last November. So since last November to, you know, here, September 18th, this whole new enterprise and this new partnership emerged. We didn't know each other. I mean, we knew a few of us knew each other, but not everyone did not know everyone else. So it was a very strange partnership and to develop so quickly, sort of a governance structure to where this really seems to be operating pretty well now. So in 6 months, 8 months, we really worked